Okay, let's unpack this. April 2nd, 2025. On the surface, just another day, right?
Right.
But that Tuesday, former President Donald Trump threw a massive curveball, didn't he? Suddenly imposing tariffs on goods from over 90 countries.
90 countries. It's quite something.
90. And the immediate fallout, well, it was like a seismic event in the financial world.
Yeah.
Trillions of dollars in value just seemed to, vanish from global stock markets within a week.
Yeah, what's fascinating here isn't just the sheer number 90 nations at once, but the speed of the market reaction. It really just hammers home how interconnected everything is.
Absolutely.
A move like this by, a major player like the U.S., it instantly sends these ripples of uncertainty everywhere.
Exactly. And for you, maybe trying to follow the headlines, make sense of the market swings, that's precisely why we're doing this deep dive. We've got a range of news analysis, some commentary here to help us understand, what prompted this, what the immediate consequences look like, and maybe if history offers any clues.
Yeah, parallels are always useful.
Right. What might happen next?
So our goal here in this deep dive is really to get past the headlines, try to grasp the core reasons behind these tariffs, trace their immediate impact across the globe, and maybe provide some historical context so you can sort of assess if this is, totally new territory or if we've seen patterns like this before.
Okay, so let's rewind. Back to April 2nd, the moment it all kicked off. What was the reasoning Trump actually gave for these sweeping tariffs?
Well, according to the sources we looked at, the central justification was pretty blunt. Other countries were ripping off the United States.
Ripping them off?
Yeah, it's a familiar theme, this idea that lots of nations are using unfair trade practices, taking advantage of the U.S. economy.
Did the sources dig into specifics on that? Or was it more of a kind of general statement?
It's a good question. It seems like it was presented more as a general assertion,
Okay. And the immediate market response described as an earthquake. That's strong language. How widespread were those drops? How bad did it get?
Well, the analysis points specifically to a Monday, April 7th, as a particularly brutal day, just losses across the board.
Where specifically?
We saw major drops in Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, Japan. Then over in Europe, Germany, the UK, the US itself, obviously, even India.
Wow.
Yeah. This really widespread downturn just shows how sensitive global markets are to these big, sudden trade policy shifts.
Right.
It wasn't just one or two places feeling it. It was like a synchronized global shudder.
And almost right away, things heated up with China specifically. How did that play out, that tit for tat?
Yes, exactly. So coincided with those first announcements on April 2nd, boom, a 34% tariff on goods coming into the U.S. from China.
Okay.
Then just 2 days later, China hits back.
Yeah.
Retaliatory 34% tariff on American goods going there.
Predictable, I suppose. And that didn't go down well.
Not at all. Reports say Trump demanded China immediately remove their tariffs and threatened to escalate things further, like a 50% increase from the U.S. side if they didn't back down.
And did China back down?
Nope. They held firm, didn't remove their tariffs. So consequently, on April 9th, the U.S. went ahead with the threat, slapped on an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods.
Yes.
And predictably again, China matched it. Another 50% tariff on American products.
So literally in just a few days, we went from zero to, well, what the sources are calling a trade war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A clear trade war between the U.S. and China. It's this escalating cycle, tariffs used as weapons, basically.
Right.
And to really get the implications, it probably helps to just quickly clarify what a tariff actually is.
Good idea. Let's break down the basics. When we say tariff, what are we actually talking about?
Okay, simplest terms. A tariff is a tax. A tax charged by a government on goods being imported from another country.
Like a sales tax, but for imports.
Sort of, yeah. The Dhruv Rathi video transcript we looked at gave some decent examples, like buying an iPhone in India that wasn't made there. You're looking at maybe a 15% import tax.
Okay.
Or, say, certain types of clothing imported into India could be 20-25% duties. Those are tariffs in action.
So why do governments do this? What's the point of taxing imports?
Well, there are usually two main reasons. First one's pretty simple. Raise money for the government, just like income tax or VAT.
Okay, revenue. Makes sense.
The second reason is often more, let's say, controversial. It's about protecting domestic industries
How does that work?
by making imported goods more expensive through the tariff, right? So the stuff made locally looks cheaper by comparison. The idea is to boost local businesses, maybe protect jobs.
Right, give the home team an advantage. But the sources also mentioned that tariffs aren't always negative. They can be used strategically. The South Korea rice example sounded interesting.
Yes, That's a fascinating case. How South Korea used rice tariffs back in the, 80s and 90s. They had a very specific long-term goal.
Which was?
Well, their local rice farmers were really struggling. They couldn't compete with cheaper imports coming in from places like the US, Thailand, Vietnam, mainly because they didn't have the same tech. So to protect those farmers, South Korea set up this clever two-tier tariff thing. They allowed a certain amount of rice in with low or even zero tariffs.
A quota, right.
But anything imported above that quota, it got hit with incredibly high tariffs. We're talking over 500% in some cases.
500%? Wow. That's basically a wall, isn't it? What does that tell you about how much protection they thought they needed?
It tells you they were serious about shielding that sector. So what was the effect?
Yeah, what happened?
Well, those huge tariffs on the extra imports made foreign rice way too expensive for most people. It gave the local farmers breathing room. Crucially, though, it wasn't just protection.
Okay.
The South Korean government was also investing heavily at the same time. Infrastructure in rural areas, agricultural research, helping farmers adopt modern tech, become more efficient.
So helping them compete in the long run.
Exactly. And over several decades, as their own rice producers got stronger, more competitive globally, South Korea started to gradually bring those super high tariffs down.
I see.
So that example shows that tariffs can work, potentially, if they're used strategically, combined with other support, and have a clear end game. Not just protection for protection's sake.
So it's all about the context, the goals, the execution. It's not inherently good or bad.
Pretty much. But, and this is a big but, the sources also stress the downside, especially the risk of starting these damaging trade wars.
Right, the retaliation aspect.
Absolutely. Think about it from the other side. Say, India, big pharma exporter, right? Maybe they sell a lot to South Korea.
Okay.
Now imagine South Korea suddenly slaps a 100% tariff on Indian medicines, maybe to protect its own drug companies.
Yeah, India wouldn't be happy.
Exactly. Especially South Korea is a big market. India's pharma industry could really suffer. Demand drops, profits fall. So when one country uses tariffs to shield itself, it can really hurt others.
And that hurt leads to hitting back, like we're seeing now with the US and China, but it could spread.
Precisely. If countries feel unfairly targeted, the natural reaction is often retaliation. Slap tariffs on goods from the country that started it. That's the basic recipe for a trade war.
Yeah.
And the sources really emphasize the best way to avoid that mess is talking. Negotiation, diplomacy. Understand each other's issues, find solutions together.
Which seems different from what happened here, imposing tariffs on 90 countries seemingly out of the blue.
Quite different, yes. This unilateral approach without much apparent consultation is what raises so many red flags.
Okay, let's circle back to Trump's stated reason. He said this was about the U.S. trade deficit, right? Even called it Liberation Day.
Yes, that was the framing.
Can you just quickly explain what a trade deficit is and why it's become such a political football?
Sure. Let's use the U.S.-China example again. If, say, America sells $1 billion worth of stuff to China in a year,
Okay.
but China sells $2 billion worth of stuff to America in that same year.
America bought more than it sold.
Exactly. So the U.S. has a trade deficit of $1 billion with China. It's just importing more than it's exporting, value-wise.
Simple enough.
Now, crucially, a trade deficit isn't automatically a bad thing, especially for a big, strong economy like the U.S. that attracts a lot of foreign investment and isn't, desperately dependent on imports for essentials.
But Trump clearly sees the U.S. deficit as a huge problem, a sign of being taken advantage of.
Yes, that's the perspective presented.
And the sources mentioned he even used national emergency powers. Declare the trade deficit a national emergency to justify the tariffs.
That's right. A very significant and frankly unusual step.
Unusual how?
Well, experts quoted in the sources were highly critical. They argued it's a misuse of executive power, potentially damaging the democratic norms. Calling a trade imbalance a national emergency is, well, it's highly unorthodox, a controversial way to justify such broad tariff.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics of these tariffs. It wasn't just China, it was like almost everyone. What were the general rules?
That's right. The information suggests a minimum tariff of 10% was put on almost all types of goods imported into the U.S.
10% minimum.
Yes. And this baseline tariff even hit imports from countries where the U.S. didn't have a trade deficit.
So the deficit argument doesn't even apply there. What was the logic?
The rationale offered was essentially that many other countries already tax American goods coming in. So these new tariffs were framed as being reciprocal.
Ah, okay. You tax us, we tax you.
Kind of. But the actual percentages imposed varied wildly, country by country.
Right. What were some of those rates?
They're all over the place. Cambodia reportedly got hit with 49%, Vietnam 46%, the European Union 20%, Taiwan 32%, South Korea 25%, India 26%, Israel 17%.
And China, we already mentioned the escalation.
Yes, with China, through the back and forth retaliation, it eventually rocketed up to a truly staggering 1,125% on both sides.
1,100%. Unbelievable. Okay, now this is where it gets really, really strange how they calculated these percentages. The sources called the formula simple, but also fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, this part is genuinely baffling. The methodology reported was, okay, take the U.S. trade deficit with a specific country.
Got it.
Divide that number by the total value of stuff the U.S. imports from that country.
Okay, math.
Let's use China again. The deficit was around $295 billion. Imports were about $439.9 billion. Divide deficit by imports. You get roughly 67%.
67%, right.
Now, here's the massive leap, the misunderstanding. That 67%, which just shows mathematically how much of our imports from China relate to the deficit, was somehow mistaken for China's existing tariff rate on U.S. goods.
Wait, what? They thought that 67% was the tariff China was already charging.
That appears to be the interpretation reported in the sources, yes.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental error.
Okay, I see the arithmetic now, but how did that translate into policy?
The administration then apparently decided to impose a U.S. tariff that was roughly half of that misinterpreted 67% figure.
Which is where the initial 34% for China came from.
Exactly. And this same flawed logic, confusing a trade deficit ratio with an actual existing tariff rate, was apparently applied across the board to all the countries.
Wow.
Shows a real misunderstanding of how trade works. Deficits happen for lots of reasons: consumer demand, investment flows. They don't just equal unfair tariffs by the other guy.
That is astonishingly misguided. So these tariffs weren't really based on what other countries were actually doing policy-wise.
Seems not. It was based on this misreading of trade balance data.
Okay.
And it gets even weirder. The sources point out the truly bizarre case of a 10% tariff being slapped on imports from, wait for it,
And
the uninhabited Hurt Island and McDonald Islands.
where? Near Antarctica.
Near Antarctica. These islands have no people. Maybe the occasional scientist visits penguins.
Penguins paying import duties. I mean, you almost have to laugh, but the consequences are serious. So what was the reaction from other countries to these tariffs based on creative math?
Well, as you'd expect, widespread anger and quick retaliation.
Right.
China, the EU, Canada, many others, they quickly announced their own retaliatory tariffs on American goods.
And they were strategic about it.
Very strategic. The sources say they deliberately targeted sectors in the U.S. where Trump has strong voter support.
Ah, hitting specific groups.
Exactly. So beyond just the obvious pain for those industries like, say, corn farming, what are the knock-on effects? Does this shift production? Cost jobs? Mess up supply chains?
Right, aiming the economic pain politically. Can you give examples?
Sure. China, for instance, went after American corn farmers, car makers. Canada targeted poultry farms, AC manufacturers. The EU reportedly aimed at steel mills, meat processing plants.
I see the pattern.
The logic seems pretty clear. Put economic pressure on the people who likely voted for the tariffs in the first place.
So it's a double hit, really.
Yeah.
Businesses in those targeted sectors suffer. And American consumers end up paying more too, right?
Exactly. When imported goods get more expensive because of tariffs, that cost usually gets passed on. Higher prices at the checkout. The example given was Mr. Beast's chocolate relies on ingredients from all over. Even if the final bar is made in the U.S., tariffs on imported cocoa or sugar drive up the cost.
Right.
So for you listening, this could mean paying more for, well, almost anything with imported components: electronics, clothes, food, you name it, even if the label says made in America.
This whole situation, it feels like deja vu. The sources brought up some historical parallels with tariffs. What can we learn from the past here?
History definitely offers some stark warnings. The U.S. has a long, complicated history with tariffs. Way back in 1789, George Washington's administration passed the first Tariff Act. Average tax was pretty low, about 5%.
Okay.
But fast forward to 1890, the McKinley Tariff. That jacked up taxes on over 1,500 items to nearly 50% on average.
50%, that's high.
Very high. And interestingly, that period is linked to the nasty economic depression of 1893. Unemployment hit something like 25%.
Ouch, a sobering connection. What happened after that high tariff period?
Well, after 1910, there was a shift. The Democrats, who generally favored lower trade barriers then, reduced tariffs. And that period saw pretty good economic growth.
Oh, okay.
But then in the 1920s, the Republicans were back in charge and raised tariffs again, trying to protect farmers, industries.
And that led somewhere bad, didn't it?
It led to the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 under President Herbert Hoover, a Republican. It hiked tariffs by over 20% across loads of sectors.
Smoot-Hawley. That rings a bell. Widely seen as a disaster, right?
Deep in the Great Depression.
Absolutely. It triggered this massive wave of retaliation from other countries. Global trade just collapsed. It plummeted by something like 66% between 1929 and 1934.
66%.
Yeah, it poured gasoline on the fire of the Great Depression. It was really after World War II that the U.S. policy flipped dramatically towards promoting free trade.
Right, leading to things like the WTO.
Exactly. Helping set up JDT, which became the World Trade Organization, all aimed at reducing tariffs and trade barriers globally. So this sudden U-turn away from decades of that policy, understandably, it's making people nervous globally.
Very nervous, yeah. Singapore's prime minister made a statement highlighted in the sources, basically warning that trade wars can be dangerous. They can even escalate into actual conflict. Drew parallels to the 1930s lead up to World War II.
Wow.
There's just widespread worry about, weakening global institutions, eroding international cooperation norms, and just the sheer unpredictability this injects into everything.
Yeah, uncertainty is poison for business.
Makes it incredibly hard for businesses, for governments to plan ahead with any confidence.
And then, just when everyone was reeling, another twist. April 9th. News breaks about a partial reversal. What happened there?
Yes, just days after the initial shock, Trump announces a 90-day pause on those new tariffs.
A pause.
For all countries except China.
Okay.
And for those other countries, the tariffs will roll back to a flat 10%.
Okay, so China still gets hit hard, but everyone else gets a partial reprieve, temporarily.
Exactly. Yeah. But the huge escalated tariffs on China stayed put. So it created this really complex, still very tense situation.
Complex is one word for it. Confusing might be another. The sources even mention speculation about stock market manipulation around this U-turn.
Yeah, there were definitely questions raised about the timing. Reportedly, the morning he announced the pause, the former president posted on social media something like, "Now's a good time to invest."
Oh.
And then, shortly after the pause was announced, the market surged. So that sequenced the tweet, then the policy changed, then the market jump led to some allegations. Was it time to benefit someone? But proving market manipulation, especially at that level, incredibly difficult.
Right. And it raises big questions about accountability, doesn't it? Who investigates that? How do you hold a president, former or sitting, accountable for things like that?
Those are absolutely critical questions. They go right to the heart of checks and balances in the system. And honestly, there aren't easy answers in the current setup.
And what about the reason for the U-turn? Theories were flying around, weren't they? Was it just the huge global backlash? Or was it some kind of grand strategy?
The sources seem to point to a couple of main theories. One, maybe the global reaction, the market chaos, was just way stronger than expected. So they pulled back partly to limit the damage.
Okay, damage control. Plausible.
The other theory is more strategic. Like maybe it was deliberate 4D chess, hit everyone hard initially to create chaos, then selectively ease off to isolate China, put maximum pressure just on Beijing.
Isolate China.
But, regardless of the why, the what is clear.
Yeah.
These kinds of erratic, unpredictable policy swings are really bad news for businesses, for the global economy. It just creates instability.
Okay, let's just quickly recap this whirlwind. We had the sudden tariffs, 90-plus countries, immediate market chaos, the trade war escalating with China, this very questionable math behind the tariff rates, retaliation from other countries, and then this abrupt, confusing, partial reversal. It's been quite a ride.
It really has. A period of major upheaval. And I think the main takeaway for anyone listening has to be the sheer level of uncertainty this has pumped into the global system.
Yeah.
The potential for more big disruptions is still very real. And for you personally, that can mean more economic uncertainty, maybe shifts in the job market, a bumpier ride for investments.
So here's maybe a final thought to chew on. What are the long-term consequences when major powers make trade policy this unpredictably, erratically? What does it mean for global cooperation, for economic stability down the road? This deep dive hopefully gives you some crucial context for making sense of whatever happens next, because it feels like this story isn't over yet.